So people have been asking me to talk a little bit about extraction in red wine making, and I thought where better to do it than from in the middle of a vat of fermenting Gevrey Chambertin. You hear a lot said these days about people in Burgundy. Oh, we only work with pump overs. We don't do any pigeage, any punching down, and talking a lot about infusion. But extraction is really a bit more complicated than that. What's really going on in a red wine fermentation like this is that the solids and the juices separate, and the gas pressure of CO2 being liberated from the fermentation forces the solids to the surface. So what we have is a supersaturated solution of carbon dioxide fermenting wine underneath and a cap of solids on top. And if you see the punching down, which is the most traditional historic way of managing the cap in Burgundy, simply consists of pushing the solids back into the fluid. There are other ways of managing a cap. The principal way is a pump over. Traditionally, that's what was done in the Medoc in the big tanks and in Pauillac and Saint-Julien or wherever. It consists of drawing wine off from the bottom of the tank and pumping it over the top. If you have a really big tank, it's the only way that's practical. And there's a sort of variant on that délestage where you rack the fluid off into an empty tank, you let the fluid ferment separate to the solids, with reducing extraction and making more friendly wines. But there are a lot of other variables that determine how extracted a red wine is that I think we should probably talk more about. I personally don't think that, in my experience at least, and those of some winemakers I've talked to, is that punching down makes wines rounder and fleshier rather than particularly necessarily extracting anything aggressive or harsh, unless it's done obviously very brutally, mechanically, perhaps with a pneumatic plunger and in a crude sort of manner. One of the other huge variables, of course, is how the grapes are pressed at the end. A lot of people do very gentle macerations and then proceed to dump the grapes, the pumice and the juice into a press and press red wine cycle 1, go off and have a beer. Of course, that's extremely extractive. You're actually mechanically squeezing the solids and extracting from them. Another thing people don't really talk about, but it's very common, is use of added extraction enzymes. Winemakers add enzymes for extraction, enzymes for clarification. It's much more common than you might think, and I think often you end up extracting things you don't necessarily want to extract. At least that's my view. I'm sure some winemakers who are fans of those techniques would disagree. Beyond that, temperature is huge. So is alcohol content, the solvent capacity of the wine, in other words. And then there are all sorts of details. I mean, for example, this is a very wide fermentation tank deliberately, and it's not even as full as it could be given that the low yields this year. So the surface that's in contact with the wine permanently of solids to liquids is greater than at a narrower, higher tank. And then beyond that, there's a duration of maceration. I tend to like to macerate really quite a long time, but without any heating at the end. A lot of winemakers will try to heat at the end to polymerize tannins, but it also amps up extraction. So there are all these many variables, and they compound. If you're heating at the end of a fermentation, you've got a lot of alcohol. It's going to be much more extractive than if you heat just to get a few extra degrees at the peak of the alcoholic fermentation when there's still sugar in the wine. So it's an interesting question, and it's I think one which is ripe to be talked about with a little bit more nuance than just saying, oh well, we do pump overs because they're more gentle than punch downs.